Thomas Markle just dropped a truth bomb that could destroy Meghan's carefully crafted image. Was it all a lie? In a stunning and emotional confession, Thomas Markle has finally broken his silence, and what he revealed about Meghan will leave you questioning everything. According to him, the explosive racism allegations made during Meghan and Harry's Oprah interview weren't spontaneous. They were scripted, rehearsed, and part of a calculated media assault. He claims Meghan secretly hired a crisis PR firm to frame the royal family as racist, weaponizing public sympathy to take control of the global narrative. But what was the endgame? And what hidden emails and contracts could prove everything? Stay with us. What you're about to hear could change everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the most explosive royal scandal in modern history was never a spontaneous cry for justice, but a meticulously calculated campaign? What if the bombshell racism claims that rocked Buckingham Palace weren't born out of lived trauma but manufactured controversy designed to ignite a global firestorm? In a world where perception is everything and the media is the battlefield, we now face a chilling question. Was the public played? Thomas Markle, the estranged father of Meghan Markle, has remained mostly silent for years. Branded a villain by some, an opportunist by others, and mostly discarded by the Duchess of Sussex herself, Thomas faded into the shadows as his daughter ascended the global stage. But today, the silence is over, and what he's revealing threatens to upend everything we thought we knew about the royal family drama. In a rare and deeply personal interview, Thomas Markle has come forward with a cache of documents, emails, and recollections that he claims are proof of a coordinated effort. One that involved high-powered publicists, crisis management experts, and a deliberate attempt to brand the British royal family as racist for personal gain. This isn't a theory whispered on internet forums or tabloids desperate for attention. This is a father's first-hand account, bolstered by the kind of evidence that can't be easily dismissed. Before Meghan Markle sat down with Oprah Winfrey in 2021, before the words about concerns over the color of Archie's skin sent shockwaves across the globe, a different conversation was taking place, behind closed doors. In high-rise offices in Los Angeles, between Meghan and some of the most ruthless image consultants in the business. According to Thomas, those meetings were not about healing or transparency. They were about strategy, about control, about narrative warfare. He claims Meghan hired a crisis PR firm months before the Oprah interview, not because of sudden media attacks or royal mistreatment, but to construct a storyline. A storyline that would make her not just a misunderstood outsider, but a victim of institutional racism at the hands of one of the world's most powerful families. This wasn't reactionary. It was intentional, deliberate, and deeply rehearsed. The firm, whose name Thomas refused to reveal for legal reasons, allegedly had a very clear mission: reposition Meghan and Harry as underdogs, silence truth-tellers who escaped the grip of a cold, colonial institution. The core of this rebranding effort? Accusations of racism. According to Thomas, the idea was presented as the ultimate reputational weapon. The royal family wouldn't be able to defend themselves without appearing even more callous. The press would seize on it. The American public, already sensitive to racial injustice, would side with Meghan. And the truth? That could be massaged later. If true, this changes everything. This isn't just about Meghan Markle. It's about the lengths people will go to for power and image. It's about manipulation on a global scale. It's about a woman who allegedly weaponized social justice to settle scores and secure sympathy. And it's about a father who, despite being pushed out of the narrative, never stopped watching it unfold. Thomas recalls specific conversations with Meghan in the months leading up to the interview. He says she became colder, more distant, and obsessed with public perception. It was all about headlines, he says. She kept saying she needed to tell her truth. But it wasn't her truth. It was a version of events that would get the most sympathy. He recounts how she allegedly spoke of media cycles and trending narratives like a PR executive, not a wounded daughter. She knew exactly what she was doing, he says, shaking his head. She wasn't just telling her story. She was planning a media ambush. He also claims to have received drafts of statements Meghan intended to release about her time in the palace. Statements that went through revisions by her legal team and media advisors. In one early draft, Thomas alleges the racism claim was vague, almost non-existent. But by the final draft, the one that would shape the Oprah interview, it had become the central theme. Thomas insists he stayed silent because he didn't want to destroy his daughter. But as he saw the royal family painted as villains, and himself lumped in with them, he felt the weight of his silence. Now, with the monarchy still reeling from accusations that may never be fully erased, he says it's time the world heard what really happened. There's right and there's wrong, he says. And what Meghan did, it wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous. To understand how dangerous, we need to look beyond the headlines and memes. We need to examine the inner workings of a modern media strategy, the anatomy of a manufactured scandal. PR firms don't just react. They create. They sculpt public sentiment, shape narratives, and silence opposition. The firm Meghan allegedly hired specializes in what insiders call perception realignment. It's a polite term for making the public believe what the client wants them to believe. According to Thomas, one of their strategies was to create an emotional hook that couldn't be questioned. Racism was the perfect choice. It's morally repugnant, universally condemned, and almost impossible to defend against without seeming complicit. Once the accusation is made, the accused loses the benefit of the doubt. That's the power of the claim. And it worked. The Oprah interview was seen by tens of millions. It dominated headlines for weeks. It sparked international discussions about colonialism, institutional bias, and the very future of the monarchy. Meghan and Harry were no longer just royals. They were victims, warriors of truth, survivors of systemic injustice. But what if it was all rehearsed? Thomas says the infamous moment when Meghan told Oprah there were concerns and conversations about Archie's skin tone was the line he could no longer ignore. That broke me, he confesses, because I knew it wasn't true. Or at least, not the way she said it. He says Meghan told him about a joke a royal made, allegedly in passing, about what their baby might look like. According to Thomas, it wasn't malicious. It was dumb, maybe tasteless. But it wasn't hatred. It wasn't racism. It was just family talk. Yet that single comment was twisted, he says, into a global indictment of the monarchy. It was the lever that shifted public sentiment, the phrase that ensured Meghan would never be seen the same way again. There's a growing unease now, in the aftermath of that interview. Even among supporters of Meghan and Harry, some are beginning to question the sincerity of the narrative. Not because they doubt that racism exists, but because they fear being manipulated. Nobody wants to be a pawn in someone else's game. And Thomas Markle, in breaking his silence, has forced that conversation into the light. He knows he'll be attacked. He knows he'll be called bitter, vengeful, opportunistic. But he says he no longer cares. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because the truth matters. His message isn't just about Meghan. It's about the systems she allegedly exploited. It's about a media environment where outrage equals influence, where tears are currency, where facts come second to feelings, and where a single interview can tear down centuries of legacy. This isn't a plea for sympathy. It's a warning. As we begin to unpack the shocking layers behind this narrative, emails, timelines, leaked strategies, and the names of those involved, we ask you to keep one question in mind. If this story could be orchestrated so flawlessly, how many others already have? Let's begin. The silence wasn't just personal. It was strategic. For over 2 years, Thomas Markle lived under the weight of a public narrative that painted him as the betrayer, the selfish father who sold out his daughter to tabloids and humiliated her before the world. The headlines never stopped. The late-night monologues never missed a chance to mock him. Social media had already decided who the villain was in Meghan Markle's royal fairy tale, and Thomas Markle played his role, whether he liked it or not. But behind the scenes, far from the bright glare of cameras and the hysteria of royal drama, something was changing. It wasn't just anger or heartbreak fueling Thomas anymore. It was the disturbing realization that what he'd seen, heard, and suspected might not only redeem him, but expose one of the most orchestrated media operations in modern celebrity history. And so, when the time finally came to speak, Thomas Markle didn't step forward with a whisper. He arrived with documents, receipts, and a timeline that, if true, could send shockwaves through every royal-supporting household and media outlet that ever reported on the Sussex saga. The interview took place at a discreet location in California, far from the media circus of London or the glitter of Montecito. The room was plain, no lights, no makeup, no handlers. Just Thomas, a retired lighting director with tired eyes and a bundle of carefully protected manila folders. His voice was steady, even when the subject matter cracked something deep inside him. He was not here for a redemption arc. He was here for something more dangerous. The truth. I know I've made mistakes, Thomas began. I know the world sees me a certain way, but I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here because the narrative you've all been sold. It's not the truth. It was never the truth. He paused, adjusted his glasses, and pulled out the first of many documents. A printed email, date-stamped 2 months before Meghan and Harry's Oprah interview. The sender was a Los Angeles-based communications strategist who'd previously worked with Hollywood A-listers. The recipient? Meghan's assistant at the time. The subject line: narrative positioning strategy, race, trauma, and royal silence. Thomas tapped the paper and said, "This is where it began." He claimed he received the document not directly from Meghan, but through a mutual acquaintance who had grown concerned about the intentions behind Meghan's media team. That acquaintance allegedly worked on the periphery of Meghan's PR circle and grew increasingly uncomfortable with the messaging being developed. "I didn't want to believe it at first," Thomas admitted. "I wanted to think maybe it was just a consultant getting overzealous. But then I saw more. Notes, drafts, talking points, carefully phrased phrases like emotional isolation, coded prejudice, public trauma. It was all planned." The moment he realized he had to speak out, Thomas said, came not from the documents, but from the people being hurt. It wasn't just me they targeted. It was the Queen. It was William. It was Kate. People who had no way to defend themselves. The royal family doesn't do interviews. They don't clap back on Twitter. They were sitting ducks for a media assault they never saw coming. The interviewer, visibly shaken, asked the question millions were thinking. "Are you saying Meghan knowingly misled the world during the Oprah interview?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yes. I'm saying it wasn't a confession. It was a campaign." He described how, in the months leading up to the interview, he noticed subtle changes in Meghan's tone during their rare communications. She became less emotional, more businesslike. Their conversations, already strained, turned colder. According to Thomas, it was as though she had rehearsed every word, even in private. "I asked her, 'Are you okay?' And she said, 'I will be. Just wait until the world hears everything.'" There was a pause. Then she said, "They won't be able to deny me after this." At the time, I thought she meant healing. Now I think she meant headlines. He revealed that his attempts to reconnect with Meghan before the interview were met with legal warnings. Letters arrived from attorneys representing the Sussexes, cautioning him against public statements, requesting that he respect their media agreements, and even threatening civil action if he interfered with scheduled media engagements. "I was being gagged," Thomas said, "and I couldn't understand why. I thought this was about telling the truth. But apparently it was only her version of the truth that mattered." He shared how he began compiling everything: texts, emails, public statements, social media screenshots, and even briefings from former colleagues of Meghan in Hollywood. It was, he claimed, the only defense he had against a wave of reputation destruction that made him a global pariah. "They turned me into a villain before I even opened my mouth," he said. And that's the power of the narrative. Once people decide you're the bad guy, you can't win. One of the most explosive moments in the interview came when Thomas shared a transcript of what he alleges to be a dry run of the Oprah interview, an internal rehearsal conducted with Meghan's media team weeks before the real event. "They practiced," he said. "They workshopped every question Oprah might ask. They had responses prepared, facial expressions planned, even emotional breaks rehearsed." He paused and looked directly into the camera. "Do you know what it feels like to watch your daughter perform pain?" It was a moment of raw vulnerability, but also deep accusation. Thomas was not just claiming deception, he was suggesting performance. That Meghan didn't merely exaggerate, she acted. He went on to reveal that one of Meghan's former college friends, who had briefly reconnected with her during her engagement to Harry, confided that Meghan had always seen fame as a stepping stone to global activism, but not in the traditional sense. She didn't want to join a cause, the friend allegedly said. She wanted to become one. Thomas said he believed that Meghan had convinced herself of her own victimhood. "It's like she needed to be oppressed in order to be important. The girl I raised, she had challenges, sure. But she was also loved, supported, and encouraged to go after anything. This version of her, the one who talks about being silenced and suicidal and unwelcome, I don't recognize her." He then reached for one final envelope, shaking slightly as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter Meghan had sent him years before her royal wedding. In it, she thanked him for always believing in her, for reminding me that I could be anyone I wanted, that I didn't need to play a role to be worthy. Thomas held the letter up and said quietly, "That girl knew who she was. This one? I think she's forgotten." The interview ended not with outrage, but with silence. No dramatic music. No sensational graphics. Just Thomas Markle sitting alone in a room, surrounded by papers, staring down the weight of a story that had spun far beyond his control. "I'm not doing this because I hate Meghan," he said. "I'm doing this because I love her. And I want her to stop lying. Not just to the world, but to herself." He added one final thought before the cameras cut out. "The truth doesn't need a press team." That single sentence, quiet and unpolished, echoed louder than any accusation. For the first time since the Oprah interview aired, someone close to Meghan had stood up and challenged the entire narrative, armed not with fame, but with memory. Not with rehearsed speeches, but with real emotion. And for millions watching, one thing had suddenly become clear. The silence wasn't just broken. It had been shattered. Before Oprah, before the primetime shockwaves and royal headlines, there was planning. Not a few offhand ideas or spontaneous venting, but deliberate, targeted media preparation. If you ask Thomas Markle, the infamous interview was not born out of emotional catharsis or raw storytelling. It was, in his words, a media event constructed from the ground up. And the deeper we look, the more that statement seems to carry weight. It started, according to Thomas, not with Meghan calling Oprah, but with Meghan calling a publicist. Months before the March 2021 interview aired, Meghan allegedly began assembling a private team of crisis consultants, media strategists, and legal experts. While Harry may have been the face of their joint grievances, Thomas claims Meghan was the architect behind the scenes. And her first move was to prepare for war. A former associate of one of Meghan's early public relations hires, who spoke under anonymity, described the approach as nothing short of presidential. She didn't just want to tell her story. She wanted to control every single layer of how it would be received. The emotions, the edits, the response. She wanted dominance, not defense. The core goal, as Thomas puts it, was to reshape public perception. The British media had spent months, even years, casting Meghan in a negative light, labeling her difficult, divisive, or attention-hungry. To counter that, Meghan's team allegedly devised a new narrative, one that would elevate her from royal renegade to righteous survivor. And the centerpiece of this rebrand would be the claim that she was a victim of racism within the royal institution. Thomas says this pivot was not born out of a single explosive incident, but rather suggested during strategic consultations. They told her that if she framed it around race, people would rally to her side, he said. They told her that racism was the one accusation that could never be dismissed or argued with. They told her that if she played it right, she wouldn't just win the argument, she'd win the war. To understand how this operation functioned, one must understand the crisis PR industry. These firms don't simply write press releases. They are behavioral engineers. They study audience psychology, media cycles, and cultural flashpoints. They know that perception, not truth, determines public opinion. Their job isn't to clarify, it's to control. According to emails shared by Thomas, Meghan's team worked on developing what they referred to as optic scripts, internal outlines for how different events, statements, and interviews would be perceived by various audiences. Each move was examined through a public lens. Every word calculated. One leaked email included language about positioning Meghan as a compassionate challenger of legacy power and leveraging Meghan's biracial identity to underscore exclusion within royal tradition. This wasn't about telling a story. This was about rewriting history while it was still happening. Multiple individuals close to Meghan's former Hollywood circle confirmed that some of her advisors had backgrounds not in journalism, but in political campaigning. They understood how to engineer scandal, control newsrooms, and craft viral narratives. One even worked on a Senate campaign before transitioning to celebrity management. They weren't just advisors. They were fixers. Thomas claims that around this time, Meghan began creating a private dossier. It allegedly contained moments she could use to substantiate her coming claims, awkward exchanges with royals, staff decisions she disagreed with, and interpretations of public events that could later be reframed as discriminatory or harmful. One entry, according to him, referred to an incident involving a royal aide correcting Meghan's use of formal protocol. At the time, it was described as a miscommunication, but later, it would be reframed as racial bias in the public-facing material. It was like watching someone take puzzle pieces from different boxes and force them together to make a completely new picture, Thomas said. It didn't matter if they fit. She just needed the final image to say what she wanted it to say. Perhaps the most chilling moment of Thomas's recollection came when he described an off-the-record conversation Meghan allegedly had with a media consultant in which she described the interview not as a risk, but as an opportunity. She said this was her Princess Diana moment, that she'd finally get to tell her truth in front of the world. But the difference is, Diana didn't have a script. What does a fully managed media rollout look like? The evidence, as presented by Thomas, suggests the process was as tightly controlled as any corporate campaign. From wardrobe to tone, background setting to body language, everything was curated. He claims that Meghan reviewed background lighting samples weeks before the interview, that her team conducted mock interviews with hired professionals to prep for potential follow-ups, that they monitored trending keywords on social media and incorporated them into the phrasing of the final talking points. In this narrative, the Oprah interview was less a reveal and more a product launch. The framing wasn't just about attacking the royal family. It was also about protecting Meghan from future scrutiny. According to a memo Thomas claims to have seen, one of the primary goals of the interview was to create what the PR world calls empathy insulation, a protective layer of public goodwill that shields a figure from criticism. Once someone is perceived as a victim of racism, any future critique is automatically framed as prejudice or ignorance. This is strategic immunity. To do this, Meghan and her team allegedly relied on a three-part formula: identification, villainization, and sanctification. First, they created emotional identification. Meghan shared her mental health struggles, her experiences of isolation, and her desire to be heard. This made her relatable. Second, they villainized the institution. The unnamed royal who questioned her baby's skin color. The palace aides who allegedly denied her help. The British press, portrayed as cruel and relentless. Third, they sanctified the Sussexes' departure. Rather than framing it as abandonment, they positioned it as liberation. The couple wasn't leaving the monarchy, they were escaping its oppression. All of this, if orchestrated as Thomas claims, required months of careful coordination. It wasn't just about one night with Oprah. It was about seeding a perception that would last years. What makes this claim even more provocative is the alleged involvement of Hollywood's inner circle. Meghan didn't rely on unknown consultants. She tapped into her network of high-level handlers, including people with connections in Netflix, major talent agencies, and even social justice nonprofits. These were people who knew how to market trauma and make it trend. Thomas, holding a stack of redacted names, expressed regret that he didn't speak sooner. I watched it all unfold, and I told myself it wasn't my place. But when the palace became a punching bag, and when Harry started cutting off his own family, I realized it was more than a PR campaign. It was a personal war, and it was destroying lives. He believes the Oprah interview was merely the first strike in a larger plan to redefine Meghan's brand not as an actress turned royal, but as a social revolutionary, a wronged woman fighting against systemic injustice. But the system she was fighting, he added, was the very institution that gave her the platform in the first place. To further prove the point, Thomas revealed that Meghan's team prepared multiple fallback plans. If the racism angle didn't take hold, they had drafts focusing more on emotional neglect, mental health denial, and cultural exclusion. Racism was simply the strongest card to play. They weren't sure which one would stick, he said. So they prepped them all. This revelation is more than just controversial. It poses fundamental questions about trust, storytelling, and the public's role in media consumption. How many of us cried during that interview? How many felt genuine rage on Meghan's behalf? How many defended her against critics without knowing the full picture? The Oprah interview may have made history, but according to Thomas Markle, history was rewritten long before the cameras rolled. When asked why he thought Meghan would go to such lengths, Thomas sat quietly for a moment, then said she wanted control, not just over her image, but over the story of her life. And to her, anything that didn't match that story, no matter how real, had to be eliminated or reimagined. His final thought as the interview closed this chapter of revelation was a warning not just to the royals, but to the world watching. The most dangerous lies, he said, are the ones people want to believe, especially when they're packaged in pain. As Chapter 2 ends, we are left staring not just at a royal scandal, but at the anatomy of a carefully engineered public reckoning. What seemed like a moment of emotional courage may, if Thomas is to be believed, have been something much more cold and calculated. This is no longer a question of who hurt whom. It's now a question of who planned it first. Language is a weapon. In the right hands, it can disarm kingdoms. In the wrong hands, it can burn them down. And according to Thomas Markle, Meghan's greatest weapon during her royal fallout wasn't fame, wasn't family drama. It was the words she chose, and more importantly, the way she delivered them. This chapter dives into one of the most controversial accusations Thomas makes, that Meghan Markle and her crisis PR team deliberately selected and rehearsed emotionally loaded trigger words designed to provoke maximum media reaction, emotional outrage, and public allegiance. These words, he claims, were not casually spoken but crafted in meeting rooms, edited in email drafts, and strategically deployed for effect. Thomas begins with a list. He recites it slowly during the interview, reading each word with the weight of someone who has heard them echo through his life ever since. Silenced, unsafe, mental health, skin color, institution, concerns, survival, truth. These words, now iconic thanks to the Oprah interview, were not only central to Meghan's statements, they were repeated verbatim across global headlines. But according to Thomas, they were chosen because they were incendiary. Each word, he says, was designed to land like a blow. He describes a moment when a former assistant of Meghan's allegedly showed him a draft outline of the talking points being considered for her public reintroduction. This was months before Oprah. At the time, Meghan and Harry were living in California and had just signed a lucrative Netflix deal. The media spotlight was relentless, but instead of retreating, Meghan's team saw an opportunity. They called it the narrative reset, Thomas says. It was about wiping the slate clean. She was going to stop being the difficult duchess and start being the brave survivor. But to do that, she needed words that stuck in people's hearts. Words that would bypass logic and hit the nerves. This was no ordinary media strategy. Meghan, he alleges, was briefed on how to use certain phrases not just to gain attention, but to emotionally manipulate. Emotional resonance was the goal. If a phrase could make someone cry, clutch their chest, or feel protective, it made the list. Silenced, for example, was one of the most effective. During the Oprah interview, Meghan said, "I just didn't want to be alive anymore. And when I went to the institution, they said they couldn't help me." The implication was clear. The royal system failed to protect a vulnerable woman in crisis. But Thomas suggests there was more behind that moment than raw honesty. He claims that Meghan's team predicted this line would become a viral quote. One of the PR documents he claims to have seen called it a sympathy anchor, a phrase so personal and haunting that anyone who questioned it afterward would appear cruel or insensitive. It also created an emotional hook that made the rest of her statements feel more credible. After all, if someone had been suicidal, how could they be lying? Another example is the term concerns about skin color. Arguably the most controversial claim Meghan made. This phrase ignited international outrage. Meghan never named who made the comment, nor did she give exact context. But the suggestion alone was enough to taint the entire monarchy with the stench of racism. According to Thomas, this phrase was no accident. It was specifically highlighted in her communication strategy as explosively sensitive. The goal was not to explain or contextualize. It was to provoke. And it did. It was like lighting a match and dropping it into dry grass, Thomas says. She didn't have to say who, or why, or even when. Just the suggestion did the damage. The genius of the strategy, if true, was its ambiguity. Meghan never accused anyone directly. She spoke in emotional generalities. She hinted. She alluded. And by doing so, she created a media vacuum, one that journalists, pundits, and audiences rushed to fill with their own conclusions. This, Thomas explains, is what PR strategists call suggestive framing. It allows a public figure to raise damning allegations without the legal risk of direct accusation. More importantly, it forces the accused to either stay silent or respond defensively, both of which fuel the fire. Other terms Meghan used were equally potent. When she referred to the institution, she wasn't just describing a workplace or family structure. She was invoking something monolithic, cold, and inhuman. A system, a machine. This depersonalization served to make her plight feel more universal. She wasn't fighting individuals, she was battling an oppressive regime. Thomas claims this was another strategic decision. If she had named individuals, people could have fact-checked it, debated it. But by saying the institution, she turned it into a faceless enemy, one that couldn't speak for itself. Then there's the word truth. Meghan and Harry both used it repeatedly. We're just telling our truth. This is my truth. But Thomas challenges that phrase with an uncomfortable reality. truth, in media, has become subjective. And in Meghan's case, it became a shield. It's the perfect defense, Thomas says. You can't argue with someone's truth. You can't ask for proof. You just have to accept it. That's why they used it. It wasn't about being honest. It was about being unquestionable. He goes on to describe how Meghan's advisors coached her on pacing and delivery. Thomas claims she was taught to pause at key moments, to let statements breathe, to look away just long enough to seem overwhelmed. These weren't spontaneous reactions. They were practiced. He references a specific moment in the interview where Meghan talks about Archie not being given a royal title. Her tone, her body language, the shift in her voice, it all suggested sorrow and injustice. But Thomas argues that these moments were polished for maximum effect. They studied body language analysis videos, he says. They knew what expressions would go viral, what tone would make people believe. It was performance. Painful, effective, and calculated. This isn't to say Meghan didn't experience hardship. Even Thomas acknowledges that being part of the royal machine is grueling, impersonal, and often cold. But he draws a line between suffering and strategic storytelling. There's a difference between being hurt and weaponizing that hurt. And I think Meghan crossed that line. He also claims that behind the scenes, Meghan's team tracked social media metrics in real time as the interview aired. They watched which phrases spiked in popularity, which clips were reshared, and which headlines gained traction. It wasn't just about telling the story. It was about managing the aftershocks. The results were overwhelming. Overnight, Meghan and Harry were recast as brave whistleblowers, victims of an outdated empire. The monarchy scrambled to respond. The Queen issued a carefully worded statement. William pushed back in a rare public comment. But the damage was done. Thomas believes it all came down to a few carefully chosen words. When you control the language, you control the emotions. When you control the emotions, you control the outcome. He closes the chapter with a chilling observation. He says the strategy was effective not because it was deceitful, but because it used the truth selectively. It emphasized the most painful parts, blurred the less convenient ones, and erased the rest entirely. She didn't lie. She curated. And sometimes, that's worse. As Chapter 3 concludes, we are left with an unsettling truth. In the war for public opinion, the first casualty is context. Words, when wielded with precision, can build legacies or destroy them. And if Thomas Markle is right, Meghan didn't just tell her story. She engineered it, line by line. Now the question is no longer what she said, but why she said it the way she did, and what else might still be on the script. The palace is a fortress. Built on centuries of tradition, it stands as a symbol of power and stability, unassailable, unmoved, silent. For generations, the monarchy has weathered storms of scandal, political upheaval, and media frenzy with a practiced poise that rarely falters. The royal family speaks only when absolutely necessary, always measured, always cautious. But what happens when that silence is broken, not by them, but by an outsider? An outsider with a carefully honed message designed to shake the foundation of everything they've built? According to Thomas Markle, the palace was blindsided by the fallout from Meghan's interview with Oprah. But it wasn't just the interview itself that caught them off guard. It was the calculated nature of the attack, the speed at which the media responded, and the depth of the emotions it triggered. What's more, Thomas claims the palace was never fully prepared for the way the press, the public, and even members of their own family would react. In this chapter, Thomas recalls what he believes was the royal family's most vulnerable moment in the wake of Meghan's interview, the internal communications that followed. For the first time, he claims, we can see the true panic that gripped the monarchy as it tried to manage the fallout. According to Thomas, it wasn't just about the media frenzy. It was about a failure to control the narrative. We were sitting ducks, Thomas says, his voice tinged with both regret and disbelief. I think the palace thought they could ride it out, just like they always have. But this time was different. In the days following the Oprah interview, Thomas claims the royal family was scrambling behind closed doors, trying to figure out how to respond to the accusations, how to address the flood of press coverage, and most importantly, how to repair the damage done to their public image. The first thing they did was try to downplay it, Thomas reveals. They sent out a couple of standard statements. We're saddened by the comments made in the interview. We'll be looking into this privately. But that didn't work. It wasn't enough. According to Thomas, the royal family didn't anticipate the sheer scale of the backlash. The immediate reaction from the public was overwhelming. Social media erupted, with people from all over the world expressing support for Meghan and condemning the royal family for their alleged mistreatment of her. The more measured royal statements only seemed to fuel the fire, making the monarchy appear distant, out of touch, and unwilling to engage with the real issues at hand. Meghan and Harry had turned the tables, Thomas says. They made the royals the villains. And when that happens, the public doesn't just side with the victims, they demand action. The palace didn't know how to respond to that. As the days passed, Thomas claims the royal family's internal communication system went into overdrive. The emails started pouring in, he says, first from the press office, then from private advisors, and then from the royals themselves. It was all panic, trying to figure out what to say, what to do. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. He goes on to describe how the royal family's response quickly became disjointed. The first email chain he alleges to have seen was from an unnamed royal advisor, recommending a public statement expressing regret over the interview, but suggesting that the family remain tight-lipped about the specifics of the claims. This strategy was seen as an attempt to avoid exacerbating the situation by making further comments. From what I understand, there was a real fear that if they spoke too much, they'd make things worse, Thomas continues. But here's the thing. The palace is used to responding to the press. They know how to craft a statement, how to respond to a scandal. What they didn't realize was that this wasn't just a scandal. It was a full-on media war. In the following days, Thomas claims the emails became more frantic as the situation worsened. One email, he alleges, came from a senior palace official who questioned whether the Queen should make a public statement about the racism allegations. The official reportedly said, "If the Queen speaks out, it may seem like we're acknowledging guilt. But if we don't speak, it could look like we're hiding something." According to Thomas, the internal debate within the palace was not about the truth of the allegations, but about how to manage the optics. They didn't know how to address it without losing control of the narrative. It was all about image. But the more they hesitated, the more the media ran with the story. Thomas reveals that at one point, the Queen's private secretary, Sir Edward Young, reportedly expressed his concerns over the media frenzy in a private email. He allegedly warned that the longer the palace waited to respond, the harder it would be to stop the growing tide of public support for Meghan and Harry. This email, Thomas claims, was part of a larger thread where palace aides discussed the potential fallout from the accusations. Sir Edward was the one person in all those emails who said something that made sense, Thomas says. He warned that if they didn't respond quickly and forcefully, they could lose their credibility. But by then, it was already too late. The damage had been done. Thomas continues, explaining that as the situation intensified, the palace began to rally behind a more direct strategy, releasing a personal statement from the Queen. However, according to Thomas, even this move was fraught with complications. The statement was drafted, but it didn't address the specifics of the racism claims. Instead, it focused on reiterating the palace's commitment to addressing issues privately and ensuring that the matter would be handled in a family setting. Thomas says the Queen's statement, while tactful, was poorly received by the public. The Queen is beloved, but she's also the head of the institution. And when she didn't immediately take a stand, people felt abandoned. It made the palace look like it was protecting its own, rather than facing the allegations head-on. In the aftermath of the statement, Thomas claims that there were more internal emails and discussions about how to manage public relations and public perceptions of Meghan and Harry's departure from the monarchy. One email, he alleges, discussed whether the couple should be stripped of their royal titles as a way of reasserting authority over the situation. By this point, the palace had already lost control of the narrative, Thomas says. They were trying to spin things back in their favor. But the more they tried to tighten their grip, the more it slipped through their fingers. But perhaps the most startling aspect of the palace's response, according to Thomas, was the realization that the accusations had struck a deeper chord than they had anticipated. The royal family had underestimated the power of Meghan's narrative. The accusations were not just about personal grievances. They had tapped into a much larger conversation about race, privilege, and systemic injustice. The palace couldn't fight back without acknowledging what Meghan had said. And that's the thing, Thomas adds, they didn't know how to defend themselves against accusations of racism without making it look like they were excusing it. It was a lose-lose situation. In the weeks that followed, Thomas claims the royal family's internal communications grew even more tense. But the emails never stopped. The palace may have been trying to regain control, but they were fighting an uphill battle. Every response they drafted, every statement they issued, seemed to deepen the divide between them and the public. It wasn't just about managing a scandal anymore, Thomas concludes. It was about surviving a media war, and they didn't have the tools for it. The palace wasn't ready for a battle like this. As the chapter closes, the real question lingers. If the royal family couldn't even control their own narrative, what chance did they have against a highly orchestrated media campaign designed to make them the villains? The emails, the debates, the internal chaos, all of it paints a picture of an institution caught completely off guard. And for Thomas Markle, the emails were the final proof that the palace had lost its grip on the most valuable thing it had left, control over the story. Behind every public scandal, there are hands at work, guiding, managing, and manipulating the narrative from behind the scenes. These figures rarely make headlines, but they are the puppet masters pulling the strings, shaping the way the world sees a story. And in the case of Meghan Markle's highly orchestrated public battle with the royal family, it wasn't just her personal grievances that fueled the narrative. It was the work of powerful PR consultants who understood the art of media manipulation better than anyone. Thomas Markle, in his exclusive interview, claims that the driving force behind Meghan's public persona in the ensuing royal scandal was a network of elite PR firms and consultants who had an extensive history of working with Hollywood stars, politicians, and media moguls. These professionals, he alleges, were not just advising Meghan, they were crafting her entire public image, from the way she spoke to the way she presented herself to the world. They didn't just help her tell her story, they helped her control it, manufacture it, and amplify it until it became an international phenomenon. I watched it all unfold, and I couldn't believe who was involved, Thomas says, shaking his head. Meghan wasn't just talking to a publicist. She was talking to some of the biggest names in crisis management and media consulting. According to Thomas, these firms weren't just hired to do damage control, they were hired to create a new narrative from scratch, one that would not only change the way the world viewed Meghan but would also forever alter the public's perception of the royal family. In short, it was a strategic operation, meticulously planned and executed with precision. And the result was nothing short of a media war, one where Meghan and Harry were positioned as the underdogs, fighting against a centuries-old institution. These PR firms, Thomas claims, had deep ties to the highest echelons of Hollywood and media power. One of the key players in Meghan's strategy, according to him, was a woman who had previously worked with high-profile A-listers, helping them navigate scandals and reshape their public images. This woman, whom Thomas refuses to name, had a history of working with clients who had been involved in controversies that threatened their careers. She was known for her ability to turn the narrative around, to make the public forget a past scandal and focus on the new version of the story. She knew how to make people sympathize, Thomas says. She could take someone who was on the verge of being canceled and make them a hero. And that's exactly what she did with Meghan. She didn't just help her deal with the press. She built her new identity. According to Thomas, Meghan's PR team didn't just focus on crisis management, they focused on creating a complete, new persona for her. One that would be seen as a victim of the system, a woman who had been unfairly treated and silenced by an oppressive institution. They crafted her as an icon of social justice, someone who had the courage to speak out against the system, no matter the cost. Meghan wasn't just another royal figure, Thomas explains. She was being turned into something bigger, a symbol of empowerment, of resistance. And all of that was intentional. In order to pull off this dramatic transformation, Thomas claims, Meghan's PR team had to be meticulous. They didn't just work with her to perfect her narrative, they worked with her to perfect the way she presented herself to the world. They carefully chose her public appearances, her interviews, and her social media posts, ensuring that everything she said and did reinforced the narrative they were trying to create. It was all about controlling the narrative, Thomas says. They knew exactly how the media would react to certain things, and they made sure Meghan did what they needed her to do to get the right response. Thomas claims that one of the key elements of Meghan's transformation was the way she used her biracial identity. According to him, Meghan's PR team understood the power of racial identity in shaping public perception. They knew that, in today's social climate, the conversation around race could not only garner sympathy, it could create a movement. Meghan didn't just identify as biracial, Thomas says. She was positioned as the victim of a royal system that couldn't accept her for who she was. It was genius. And it worked. Thomas explains that the focus on race wasn't just a side note in Meghan's narrative, it was the cornerstone of her new public identity. The moment Meghan spoke about racism, the world's eyes turned to her. People started seeing her not just as a royal, but as a victim of something much larger. Something that spoke to issues of power, privilege, and inequality. He also claims that Meghan's team knew exactly how to leverage the media's fascination with her. They knew how to manipulate the press and keep the attention focused on Meghan and her struggles. Meghan was never going to be the same person she was before all of this, Thomas says. And that was part of the plan. They were turning her into a global icon, and nothing was going to get in the way of that. But while Meghan's PR team was working to construct her new identity, they were also working to undermine the royal family's image. According to Thomas, one of the key strategies was to turn the royals into the antagonists of the story. They weren't just misunderstood, they were actively preventing Meghan from living her truth. And in order to do this, they needed to manipulate the narrative around the royal family's treatment of Meghan. Thomas claims that Meghan's team encouraged her to speak out about her personal experiences with the royals, to paint them as unsupportive and even discriminatory. Every detail of Meghan's complaints, from her treatment by palace staff to her struggles with the press, was carefully choreographed to elicit public sympathy and make the royals appear cold, detached, and out of touch. They made sure Meghan's complaints resonated, Thomas says. They made sure she sounded like a woman who had been silenced, pushed aside, and rejected by the very family she had joined. And when she spoke, it was clear she wasn't just talking about herself, she was talking about something much bigger. She was giving a voice to anyone who had ever felt marginalized or oppressed. But even as Meghan was being positioned as a champion of social justice, Thomas claims that her PR team was also aware of the risks involved. After all, it's one thing to be a victim. It's another to be seen as manipulative or calculating. To mitigate this risk, Thomas says, Meghan's team worked to ensure that her image was never overtly aggressive or confrontational. Instead, they framed her as someone who was simply telling her truth, someone who had been forced to speak out because no one else would. They knew Meghan couldn't come off as angry, Thomas explains. She had to seem calm, collected, and almost sorrowful. She had to be the victim, not the aggressor. And so, with the help of her high-powered PR team, Meghan's story was refined, honed, and positioned for maximum impact. It wasn't just about her struggles with the royal family. It was about creating a larger narrative of resilience, empowerment, and justice. But as Thomas has come to realize, this narrative was built on more than just truth. It was built on strategy. Meghan may have had a story to tell, but her team knew exactly how to make sure the world heard it. As Chapter 5 concludes, we're left to reflect on a simple, yet troubling truth. While Meghan Markle may have been at the center of this media spectacle, it was the unseen PR power brokers who truly controlled the narrative. And their influence continues to shape the way the world views Meghan, the royal family, and the larger issues at play. In the world of Hollywood, the line between fiction and reality is often blurred. Stars are not just performers. They are brands, carefully crafted and marketed to the masses. Their lives are no longer private. They are stories to be consumed, dissected, and monetized. And in this world, sympathy is not just an emotion. It is a commodity, one that can be traded for power, influence, and control. Meghan Markle, Thomas claims, understood this concept better than most. From the moment she stepped into the public eye, she was not just an actress or a royal. She was a brand in the making. And in the age of social justice and cancel culture, the most valuable brand is often one that embodies victimhood. In this chapter, Thomas dives into one of the most controversial aspects of Meghan's narrative, the way she and her PR team used victimhood as a strategic tool. This wasn't about genuine hardship, he argues. It was about leveraging personal pain and trauma for maximum emotional impact, ensuring that the public would not only empathize but rally behind her. Meghan's story, he says, wasn't just one of survival, it was one of branding, carefully cultivated and carefully sold. You have to understand, Thomas says, leaning forward, in Hollywood, victimhood is a brand. If you can position yourself as someone who has suffered, who has been wronged, who has been silenced, you can do anything. You can control the narrative, and you can get people to follow you. He points out that the most successful Hollywood celebrities are often those who have been able to craft compelling personal stories of struggle and redemption. These stories resonate with audiences because they tap into universal emotions, empathy, anger, and the desire for justice. In a world where everyone is looking for heroes, the most effective heroes are those who can present themselves as victims first. This isn't just about Meghan's personal pain, Thomas says. This is about building a narrative that makes people see her as someone who has been oppressed by the very system she tried to fit into. It's about turning her into a hero for a cause. According to Thomas, Meghan's PR team understood this concept all too well. They knew that the key to making her a global icon wasn't just about telling her truth. It was about framing that truth in a way that would elicit maximum sympathy. It wasn't enough to simply say that Meghan had been treated unfairly by the royal family. She needed to be portrayed as a woman who had been silenced, ignored, and mistreated to the point where she had no choice but to speak out. Thomas claims that one of the first pieces of advice Meghan received from her PR team was to embrace her identity as a victim. This wasn't just about talking about the difficulties she faced as a member of the royal family. It was about positioning herself as someone who had been wronged by an entire system, someone who had been denied her voice and her dignity. This, Thomas believes, was the foundation of Meghan's public image. Victimhood, he says, was not just a byproduct of her experiences. It was a carefully crafted aspect of her story. It was the reason people would sympathize with her. It was the reason people would fight for her. One of the most powerful tools in this strategy, according to Thomas, was Meghan's use of mental health as a narrative driver. In the Oprah interview, Meghan spoke candidly about her struggles with suicidal thoughts, her feelings of isolation, and her sense of being trapped in a system that did not care for her well-being. These moments, Thomas argues, were designed to humanize Meghan, to make her seem vulnerable and relatable. Let's be clear, Thomas says. Mental health struggles are real. They're not something to be taken lightly. But in Meghan's case, mental health became part of her branding strategy. It wasn't just about sharing her pain. It was about ensuring the world saw her as someone who had been betrayed by the very system that was supposed to protect her. He explains that in Hollywood, mental health is increasingly becoming a powerful tool for celebrity brands. The more a celebrity can position themselves as someone who has battled personal demons and emerged victorious, the more marketable they become. Meghan's openness about her struggles, Thomas claims, was not just about healing. It was about selling a story. This isn't about knocking her struggles, Thomas says. But when you see how carefully it was all framed, how every word was chosen to elicit a specific emotional reaction, you start to realize that this wasn't just a woman telling her story. This was a carefully managed performance. The key, Thomas claims, was ensuring that Meghan's victimhood was framed in a way that made her seem like an underdog fighting against an institution that was too big to fail. It wasn't enough to simply be a member of the royal family who had been mistreated. It was about being part of a larger narrative about power, privilege, and injustice. According to Thomas, Meghan's PR team also ensured that every public statement she made about her struggles was framed as part of a larger, more universal fight. By positioning herself as a victim of the royal family, she was able to tap into larger societal conversations about race, gender, and mental health. These conversations were not just relevant. They were central to the story that Meghan and her team wanted to tell. We live in a world now, Thomas says, where if you can make yourself the victim, you can't be criticized. You can't be questioned. And that's what Meghan and her PR team understood. They knew that once she positioned herself as the victim, she was untouchable. People would rally around her. The power of this strategy, Thomas argues, lies in its ability to disarm critics. When Meghan was accused of manipulating the narrative or exaggerating her pain, she could simply point to the backlash and say, "See, this is what I've been talking about. This is the system that silences people like me." By framing herself as the voice of the oppressed, Meghan was able to command sympathy and support, even from those who may have initially been skeptical of her motives. This, Thomas claims, was the true brilliance of the PR campaign behind her public persona. It made Meghan untouchable, not because of her actions, but because of the narrative that had been constructed around her. But Thomas also notes a darker side to this strategy. While victimhood can generate immense public support, it can also create a sense of entitlement. Once a person is seen as a victim, their actions can be excused, their flaws overlooked, and their mistakes forgiven. But the more Meghan leaned into this image, the more she became trapped by it. There's only so far you can go with being the victim, Thomas says. Eventually, people start to see through the act. They start to question whether you really are the victim, or if you've just gotten really good at playing the role. As the chapter closes, Thomas reflects on the lasting impact of the victimhood branding strategy. He acknowledges that Meghan's story resonates with many people, particularly those who feel marginalized or oppressed. But he also believes that, in the end, It may have been the very strategy that alienated her from the people who once supported her. It's a double-edged sword, Thomas says. It gets you sympathy, but it also keeps you stuck in a narrative you can't escape from. In a world where empathy is currency, Meghan Markle may have built an empire. But as Thomas suggests, that empire is built on a foundation of carefully crafted pain, and it may one day collapse under its own. For years, Thomas Markle remained largely silent as his daughter, Meghan, soared into the global spotlight. While tabloids painted him as a villain, an estranged, bitter father with a penchant for public outbursts, he quietly watched as Meghan's narrative took on a life of its own. And while the media focused on the drama between Meghan and the royal family, Thomas found himself relegated to the shadows, his side of the story dismissed as little more than the ramblings of a disgruntled relative. But the silence, Thomas now claims, was not a result of indifference. It was a product of fear that speaking out would not only ruin his relationship with his daughter, but also reinforce the narrative that he was the cause of all the family's turmoil. He knew that if he spoke out, the world would see him as the angry father, the one who was bitter because he had been left behind. He knew that the media would twist his words, framing him as the villain. For a long time, Thomas kept quiet, watching as Meghan's public image was meticulously crafted and presented to the world as the victim of royal oppression. But eventually, Thomas began to realize something far more troubling. Meghan wasn't just telling her story. She was rewriting it, erasing parts of their history, and carefully editing the narrative in a way that made her the central hero and him the villain. It was like watching someone erase my existence, Thomas says. It wasn't just the royal family that was being vilified, it was me. I was the one who had been erased from the picture entirely. In the months leading up to the Oprah interview, Thomas claims he began collecting evidence. He started documenting the conversations he'd had with Meghan, the letters she had sent him, and the moments he remembered from their time together. What he found, he says, was a disturbing pattern. Meghan was not the person she had once been. She was someone entirely different, someone who had been shaped by her new life, her new image, and her new story. One of the most shocking pieces of evidence Thomas uncovered was a series of letters Meghan had sent him prior to her marriage to Harry. In these letters, Meghan spoke of her love for her father, her gratitude for his support, and her desire to stay connected with him. Yet, in the wake of her rise to fame, these letters became increasingly scarce, and soon, Thomas found himself on the receiving end of legal threats, cautioning him against speaking publicly. These letters weren't just about maintaining a relationship, Thomas says. They were about control. Meghan knew how to play the game. She knew how to make people believe what she wanted them to believe. As the years went by and Meghan's relationship with the royal family became more strained, Thomas began to see that the narrative surrounding his daughter was shifting. She was no longer the actress turned royal. She was a crusader, a victim, and a voice for the oppressed. And in the process, Thomas says, he became collateral damage. I wasn't just her father, he says. I was the obstacle. The one who had to be silenced in order to protect the story she was telling. The Oprah interview was supposed to be a revelation. It was billed as Meghan's opportunity to finally tell her truth, to speak openly about her struggles within the royal family, and to address the accusations that had been leveled against her. But for Thomas Markle, the interview was less about truth and more about performance. It was a highly crafted spectacle, one in which every word, every gesture, and every pause had been carefully orchestrated. I didn't watch it live, Thomas says. But when I saw the clips afterward, I knew something wasn't right. I could see how every moment was calculated. Every pause. Every look. It wasn't just an interview. It was a production. Thomas is particularly critical of Meghan's portrayal of the royal family, especially her claim that there were concerns about the color of her son Archie's skin. She never named names, Thomas says, and that's the key. She didn't have to. The moment she said those words, the media took over. The public filled in the blanks. It didn't matter who said what. The accusation was enough. The impact of this accusation, Thomas believes, was immediate and devastating. The royal family was thrust into a firestorm of accusations and condemnation, with few ways to defend themselves. Meghan's phrasing, Thomas argues, was deliberate and designed to provoke a certain emotional response. It wasn't about telling the truth, it was about creating a story that would be impossible to refute. The moment she made that claim, Thomas says, the royal family lost the battle. Because who could argue with racism? Who could deny it? But what struck Thomas most about the interview was the way Meghan positioned herself. She was the victim, and everyone else, the royal family, the press, and even her own father was painted as the villain. I've seen people go through hardship, Thomas says, but I've never seen anyone weaponize their pain the way Meghan did. He explains that Meghan's use of language, her careful selection of words, and her ability to evoke sympathy were all part of a larger strategy. She wasn't just sharing her personal experiences. She was crafting a narrative that would not only justify her actions but also shift public opinion in her favor. The Oprah interview wasn't about healing, Thomas says. It was about winning. In the aftermath of the Oprah interview, Thomas watched as Meghan and Harry were transformed from controversial figures to media darlings. They were praised for their courage, their honesty, and their willingness to speak out against an institution that had mistreated them. But for Thomas, the real victims in this narrative were the people who had been left behind, the people who had been silenced in order to protect Meghan's image. The public was so quick to side with her, Thomas says. They didn't ask questions. They didn't consider the possibility that there was more to the story. They just assumed she was right because she was the victim. And in doing so, they ignored the truth. For Thomas, the real tragedy lies in the way the royal family was painted as the villain, when, in his view, they had done nothing wrong. He believes that the monarchy's silence in the face of the allegations only made them appear guilty, further fueling the media frenzy. The truth got lost in the noise, Thomas says. And in the end, the real victims were the ones who had no voice. As Thomas reflects on the events that led up to Meghan's departure from the royal family and the subsequent media firestorm, he is left with a sense of betrayal, not just by his daughter, but by the system that allowed her to control the narrative. The world doesn't want to hear the other side, he says. They don't want to hear the truth if it doesn't fit the story they've already made up. And that's the most dangerous part. In the end, the story of Meghan Markle and her relationship with the royal family is not just one of personal struggle, it is a cautionary tale about the power of narrative. The ability to shape and control the story is one of the most powerful tools in modern society, and Meghan, with the help of her PR team, demonstrated just how effective it can be. For Thomas Markle, the pain lies not in the public's perception of his daughter, but in the manipulation of the truth. As he looks back on the years of silence and observation, he is left wondering how much of Meghan's story is real and how much of it was created to serve a larger agenda. Meghan isn't the same person I raised, Thomas says quietly. But the world doesn't want to know the truth. They just want to believe the story. As the dust continues to settle, one thing remains clear. In the battle